This video is made possible by our generous supporters on Patreon. Check out patreon.com/NWR for all the details. Between April of 1998 and July 2004, something absolutely ridiculous happened in the world of video games. Within this span of about 6 years, game developer and publisher 3DO released 19 games in a new series called Army Men, averaging out to a game every 3 months at its peak. The games spanned a vast array of genres, but each one centered around waging war as plastic green army men against the tan army. When we factor in that many of these games had entirely unique versions on each of their release platforms, the actual number of games is more like 30 or so. But of the many entries in the Army Men series released prior to 3DO selling off the IP, 11 of them were released on a Nintendo platform, and 3 of those were on the Nintendo 64. Now, one could easily fill a several-hour-long documentary with the story of this franchise, but for today, I just want to focus on those 3 Nintendo 64 games. My name is John Rairdin, and welcome to Third Party 64, where we'll explore the often unsung third-party library of the Nintendo 64. Because contrary to popular belief, Rare and Nintendo weren't the only people making games for this thing. I grew up loving the Army Men series as a whole, but the titles released on the Nintendo 64 were my personal favorites. The 3 games in question are Army Men Sarge's Heroes, Army Men Air Combat, and Army Men Sarge's Heroes 2. Today, we're going to dig into these 3 games and their legacy, as well as explore a bit more of their development than I'm usually able to, thanks to some help from our friends at the Video Game History Foundation. The first Army Men game, simply called Army Men, released on PC in early 1998. The studio behind it was 3DO, which had recently transitioned away from their hardware aspirations and into a role as a game developer and publisher. The studio was helmed by Trip Hawkins, who had also founded EA. Hawkins wanted 3DO to run like a Hollywood film studio, and took a particular interest in creating franchises. Army Men had the potential to be big, and 3DO was ready to go all in. The following year, 1999, would see the release of 5 Army Men games. 2 would be sequels in the style of the original PC game. 1 would be a conversion of the first game into 3D on the PlayStation. Another would be a spin-off helicopter game, also for the PlayStation. And finally, 1 would be a character-driven third-person shooter for the Nintendo 64. Michael Mendheim was wrapping up work on another 3DO title, Battle Tanks, when he began work on a pitch for an Army Men spin-off in early 1998 under the working title Ultra Army Men. I had a chance to sit down and talk with Michael alongside Frank Cifaldi of the Video Game History Foundation, where he walked us through the ideas behind his pitch for Ultra Army Men.
I saw what they were doing on the Army Men after Battle Tanks. Battle Tanks was extremely successful for 3DO. After that, they said, hey, here's Army Men. We're working on the PC and we're working on the PlayStation now. They started to port it to PlayStation. Can you do this for Nintendo? And they wanted it for Christmas. I wanted to make it a Christmas present. So if you got this in a box, and you unwrapped it, and there's Sarge's Heroes, and you play the game, and there's Christmas themes, I just wanted it to be a really cool toy for Christmas. So that was number 1. And then number 2, it's like I wanted personality. Like, I wanted all these guys to have clear, distinct personalities, and I wanted to make people laugh and have it be funny and stupid and outrageous, and childish humor and adult humor. It needed to have a soul.
Mendheim donated much of his documentation around the development of his games to the Video Game History Foundation, who have been kind enough to give me free reign of all of this material. If you'd like to see a deep dive into some of the new information we uncovered specifically surrounding Sarge's Heroes, check out the video I produced on their channel. I'll link to it in the description. Thanks to this documentation, we can get a sense of the incredible degree of ambition he had for his Army Men game. The final version of his design pitch, which he refers to as a script, is dated to April 1998, about a year and a half before the game would ultimately be on store shelves. It lays out plans to make what he calls 3DO's Mario, with movie-quality animation, AI-driven squad mates, vehicle segments, and more. One early draft even pitches the idea of 4-player co-op for the entire campaign. While much of this ambition would ultimately need to be scaled back to hit the deadlines and budget the team was given, one key element remained unchanged from that initial document: to embrace the childish fun that seemed to him inherent in the underlying concept of the IP.
They were trying to do a simulated war game with these green and tan soldiers, but I thought it needed some heart. Like, it needed some soul, because these are our toys. And I played with army men, man. I had all kinds of army men. I had G.I. Joes. Like, I was totally into those. So for me, if you're gonna do that concept, you gotta make people laugh. Like, it's gotta be like a nostalgia. It's gotta be like a toy. And like Toy Story, like when you see the army men come on the screen, they just kind of steal the show. And it's hard to steal the show in Toy Story from like Buzz Lightyear, but those army men soldiers stole the show, and there's a lot of heart and nostalgia around them.
The thing to keep in mind about the first Army Men game, if you haven't played it, is that for a game that is ostensibly about toys, the story played it remarkably straight. The game takes place almost entirely in the world of the Army Men rather than in our world. As such, the fact that the characters were all solid-colored plastic kind of feels more like an excuse for sprite swapping than anything that would actually factor into game design.
And my whole thing was, I wanted them to be toys. Like, I thought putting them on a battlefield would be boring. But putting them in a bathtub or on a kitchen counter or fighting underneath a Christmas tree, like, now you're playing with toys.
What Sarge's Heroes did for the fledgling Army Men series was give it an actual identity. It established a cast of characters, a fun, lighthearted tone, and a visual style built around the 3D capabilities of the Nintendo 64. The game sees you as Sergeant Hawk, working with Colonel Grimm to rescue the scattered members of Bravo Company. These would be the first distinct characters the series had had, rather than the identical Army Men seen in other entries. Each one has its own unique visual design and personality. Mendheim's background was as an artist, so establishing a strong visual identity for the game in both its characters and environments seems to have been extremely important, as we can see from the wide array of concept art found in this documentation. The game itself is a third-person shooter that takes heavy inspiration from both Tomb Raider and Super Mario 64. It features large levels with plenty of optional nooks and crannies to explore. Many of its combat scenarios can be approached from multiple angles, giving the player free reign of how they tackle each stage. For example, in the second level, you need to hunt down a blue spy that's hiding in this town. The most straightforward way to reach the town is by following the main road. However, it's patrolled by tanks and tan soldiers. You can do it, but it's dangerous. On the other hand, if you peel off to the right instead, you can work your way up onto this cliff, where you can use a sniper to pick off some of the enemies. Climb down this cliff and go behind this building, and you can take out one of the patrolling tanks while skipping past the rest of the guards on the road. Once you make it to the town, the game again presents you with options. You can, once again, follow the main road into the town and fight your way through enemy tanks. Alternatively, you can turn left and climb up on top of one of the houses. From here, you can clear out the enemy from relative safety before fighting your way through this house and finding the spy. Another option that will likely only be apparent to players returning to the level having already finished it is to work your way around the town, then hop up onto this roof, landing directly in front of the house and skipping those tanks altogether. This is the kind of game design that I always loved in the first Sarge's Heroes. It isn't quite what you would call a modern immersive sim, but it gives the player wide open level design with constant options and side areas. It wasn't the only game doing this sort of thing at the time, but I don't think it gets enough credit for how well it actually pulls it off. It's also something that was very specifically built around the strengths of the Nintendo 64 as a piece of hardware. When it comes to actual 3D rendering, the Nintendo 64 had a significant advantage over the PlayStation for a couple of key reasons. Firstly, the Nintendo 64 has a proper Z-buffer, allowing it to accurately calculate what objects are closest to the camera and then render them in the correct order, thus preventing an object in the background from appearing in front of an object in the foreground, something you actually see a lot if you look at PlayStation games. It also allowed for higher floating point precision for 3D objects than the PlayStation did. Essentially on the PlayStation, any vertex point on a 3D object has to snap to an integer value for its position, whereas on the N64, it can use decimal points to have a more precise location. This prevented the somewhat jittery look that 3D models on PlayStation often had. Finally, it could also calculate perspective-correct texture mapping at angles. On PlayStation, if you had a textured polygon and then you looked at it from an extreme angle, the texture would sort of warble back and forth. On PlayStation, you would get around this by subdividing that polygon into a bunch of other polygons, but then you're using up a huge amount of your polygon budget on every triangle. On N64, you didn't have to do that. So the Nintendo 64 could create a massive yet visually stable environment from very few polygons. All this meant that when the game was eventually adapted for PlayStation, it came at a pretty heavy cost, with every level being simplified in some way. Remember the town level I just finished talking about? You can no longer climb on top of buildings or go inside them. Other segments, such as the entire final level which takes place in a bathroom, is kinda just missing from the PlayStation version. While it does get some great pre-rendered cutscenes, it's otherwise a harshly simplified version of the game. But perhaps the most fascinating technical feature of Sarge's Heroes is how it renders its characters. Forgive me for getting into the weeds a bit here, but as someone with a background in 3D modeling and animation, I need to highlight how Sarge's Heroes did something that Nintendo's own documentation says shouldn't really be possible. So if you look at this game running on the Nintendo 64, something that immediately stands out is how the plastic army men actually look plasticky. This is done by combining a very well done texture, which bakes in some nice shadowing, with a specular highlight that makes the army men appear shiny. The only problem is that officially, the Nintendo 64 couldn't support specular highlights on a textured object. This is because the specular highlight, which is just a texture that's being moved across the object to correspond to a light source to give it that shiny look, is already using up the texture layer. So you can't have two things existing in that same layer at the same time. And I'm not just pulling this out of nowhere, this is from Nintendo's programming manual for the Nintendo 64 distributed by Nintendo of America. You can look it up if you want to. So how did Sarge's Heroes get around this? Well, remember how I said the Nintendo 64 could build a large environment out of relatively few polygons? This particular strength meant that the system had a fair amount of leftover polygons in its budget. So they could duplicate any textured polygon that needed that plastic sheen to it. The specular highlight could then be assigned as an alpha texture, meaning that anything black in the texture would be transparent and anything white would be opaque. Anywhere the specular texture was transparent, it would show through to the duplicate polygon underneath that had a traditional texture. As a result, you essentially get a multi-layered texture that isn't officially supported by the system. It's honestly like a generation ahead of a lot of the texturing we'd see on other N64 games. One of the only other instances of a similar technique being used that I've been able to find is in Ridge Racer 64, but it's worth noting that Ridge Racer 64 uses significantly simpler texture mapping, relying on a lot of solid colors where they could sort of cheat it and they wouldn't need to double up on geometry. Its use in Sarge's Heroes with fully texture mapped characters is truly impressive and, as far as I can tell, one of a kind. Of course, beyond the single player, there was also a 4-player split-screen multiplayer mode. Here, players pick a character, a color of plastic, and duke it out across a variety of stages. While elements of this gameplay took influence from Rare's GoldenEye, Mendheim's own Battle Tanks was also a source of inspiration. It had been a major hit for 3DO as a unique multiplayer game within the Nintendo 64's library. While Sarge's Heroes certainly isn't the iconic 90s game night multiplayer title that GoldenEye was, I did spend quite a few sleepovers as a kid playing this with my friends. Army Men Sarge's Heroes would release just a year and a half after it entered full production, in September of 1999 on Nintendo 64, before being followed by versions on PlayStation, Dreamcast, and PC the following year. Of the 3 console versions, the Nintendo 64 version would be the most highly reviewed. Next would be the Dreamcast version, which was a port of the Nintendo 64 version with enhanced graphics that unfortunately has some added control issues. While reviews wavered somewhat, especially for the PlayStation version, Sarge's Heroes would ultimately be one of 3DO's most successful titles, selling more than 1.3 million units between the PlayStation and N64 versions. But perhaps more importantly, it established an identity for the franchise that was already being integrated before Sarge's Heroes had even been released. Because alongside Sarge's Heroes, another Army Men spin-off was being developed, and it would be the first to embrace this new cast of characters. The game that Nintendo 64 fans know as Army Men Air Combat was first released on PlayStation in 1999 as Army Men Air Attack. Now, contrary to what you'll find if you look this game up online, it isn't actually a totally straight port of Air Attack. Rather, Air Combat, which would release the following year in 2000, is sorta like an extended edition. And a lot of this ties back into the technical things we talked about in Sarge's Heroes. When it comes right down to it, the PlayStation and Nintendo 64 were extremely different pieces of hardware, and they had different strengths and weaknesses. And 3DO was pretty good at leaning into that. For the sake of clarity, I'm mostly going to use the Nintendo 64 title, Army Men Air Combat. Not for any particular reason other than the Nintendo 64 version is what I grew up with, so that's the title that my brain just sorta defaults to. Army Men Air Combat is a top-down helicopter combat game. Its unique mechanic centers around a winch system for your aircraft. You can use it to pick up weapons, ammo, and health, but also to transport objectives or, honestly, most of the objects in the environment. In an IGN interview published during the development of the Nintendo 64 version, Kudo Tsunoda, the director of the game, said that, "We're really trying to focus more on the playing with toys aspect of the franchise. We're really playing up that this is a little plastic toy helicopter." The idea of leaning into the fact that these characters are toys seems to have been shared quite naturally between both the Air Combat and Sarge's Heroes teams. Mendheim told us that Tsunoda approached the Sarge's Heroes team to not only use their cast of characters for his game, but to request they design a character for his game as well. You play as this character, Captain William Blade, but you'll take your orders from Colonel Grimm, just like in Sarge's Heroes. You'll also fly missions where you're directly supporting the Sarge's Heroes cast. By the end of 1999, these two spin-off titles had cemented a well-established world with so much character that the entire series would essentially wind up leaving the original behind in favor of the world these two games had created. But beyond helping to define an identity for the franchise, Air Combat was also an original and fun take on a helicopter combat game, a genre that had been around for quite a while by this point. We're throwing in a lot more neutral environmental enemies, so you'll have bees that swarm out and attack you, and mutant bugs that you have to fight against. A lot of the missions are based more on using your helicopter's winch and interacting with the environments than they are on flying around and blowing things up. The focus on moving objects around the environment gives Air Combat more sandbox-style gameplay than you generally see in a helicopter game. For example, you could pick up a bunch of pop cans and use them to make a fort. You could surround an anthill with rocks and then make the only way out pass directly through a tan base. And from a technical perspective, giving players the freedom to potentially gather up every dynamic object in a level and put it in the same place is pretty impressive on the Nintendo 64. People tend to pick up stuff and build little encampments out of all the different world objects, pile up all the soda cans and things like that, and then have a huge battle with it all. It's difficult technology-wise. I mean, it's great for the gamers, but when I talk to the programmers about what we want to do with the game, they look at me like, I'd like to kill you. Multiplayer is where most of the Nintendo 64's unique elements come into play. Both versions allow you to play the game cooperatively, and on PlayStation there was also a competitive capture the flag mode. But keep in mind, the PlayStation only had 2 controller ports natively built into the system, while the Nintendo 64 had 4. Thus, this was one area where Nintendo's hardware could be taken advantage of. Nintendo 64 adds the ability to play with 4 players and adds 3 more multiplayer modes, ranging from straightforward combat to PvE-style bug hunts. It makes the Nintendo 64 version arguably superior in terms of raw content, though I will note that it's clear this game was originally designed based on the PlayStation's strengths. As I pointed out earlier, in general the Nintendo 64 was better at rendering 3D than the PlayStation was, and yet there were other things that worked better on the PlayStation. For example, the PlayStation's expanded memory on discs compared to the Nintendo 64's cartridges meant that textures could generally be significantly higher resolution. However, as we talked about, hardware limitations in the PlayStation itself prevented textures from displaying correctly at harsh angles. As a result, they would appear somewhat warped and unstable. But a top-down game like Air Combat was a perfect fit. It could take advantage of those high-resolution textures, but present them in a way as to not be hurt by the limitations of the platform. As a result, Air Attack looks fantastic and sharp on the PlayStation. On the Nintendo 64, I'd still say it looks good, and the 3D itself tends to be a bit more stable, but texture resolution is noticeably lower. The art has been reworked, so you wouldn't really notice unless they were side by side. But there is one other, much more odd difference. Air Attack on the PlayStation features an original soundtrack by composer Birch Treichman. It's quite good and manages to stand out in a series with some great music. But for some reason, none of it appears on the Nintendo 64 version. The main theme has been replaced with the main theme from Army Men Sarge's Heroes, the soundtrack for which was composed by Barry Bloom, Kevin Manthei, Robin Mendheim, Brian Min, and Brian Withicum. Given that, you may expect the rest of the soundtrack to also be pulled from Sarge's Heroes, or at least a previous Army Men game. It isn't, but it also isn't a new soundtrack. It's actually pulled from another 3DO game that came out earlier that same year. Battletanks Global Assault, composed by Barry Blum and Brian Min. Now, as for why exactly this was done, I can only offer a guess. Air Attack on PS1 would have used CD audio for its soundtrack, while the Nintendo 64 would need to use MIDI. If you're unfamiliar with these terms, CD audio would be pre-recorded pieces of music, while MIDI is generated live from a file using onboard synthesizers. MIDI is comparatively small, so it makes more sense to use on the limited cartridge space of the Nintendo 64. Given that the Nintendo 64 version had such a short development time of about half a year, I suspect it was easier to use existing MIDI files rather than rework the original soundtrack for the Nintendo 64 by limiting the channels and assigning voices for all the instruments. As for why they pulled music from a game outside of the Army Men franchise, I have no idea. It's a great soundtrack, it's just very strange. But of the 5 Army Men games with their initial release dates in 1999, Army Men Sarge's Heroes and Army Men Air Attack stood out as clear favorites. Though shout out to Army Men 2 on PC, which did a fantastic job of improving on the original PC game in every way. But from here, the course of Army Men had been set, and 3DO did not intend to slow down.
But the problem was then with the success of these early titles, they just wanted more and more. And I was always against it. And I was like, in our exec staff meetings, I was the one guy who's be like, nope. Because I thought it was going to cannibalize the products and that we were rushing them and we couldn't do quality. And I just thought a much better strategy was one Army Men game a year. This one's the simulation. Now comes the character story-based game. Now comes Air Attack. And, you know, you've got enough of a cycle between Sarge's Heroes 1 and 2 where it's been a couple years. Now, you know, maybe they're ready for a sequel, but that's not what we did.
Army Men Sarge's Heroes 2 released almost exactly 1 year after the first Sarge's Heroes had released on Nintendo 64. Once again, it would spend a brief time as a Nintendo 64 exclusive before coming to PlayStation a couple months later, and even the PlayStation 2 the following year. This one also has a Game Boy Color version, but unlike the rest of the Game Boy Color Army Men games, which are honestly pretty solid ports, this one is an entirely different game, but that's a topic for a different video. The game kept several members of the core Sarge's Heroes team from the previous N64 version, including Mendheim himself, art director Nina Stanley, and technical director Dan Geisler. But new to the team was director Tim May, along with several new members of the actual design team. Mendheim, who had largely been completely in charge of the first game, would step into a more supervisory role. It began development under the working title Store Wars. The core design document we have from Mendheim's notes tells us that development started immediately following the release of Army Men Sarge's Heroes and before Air Combat had even made its way to the Nintendo 64. This document is dated to December 22nd of 1999, just 9 months prior to the release on September 27th, 2000. We can once again see a focus on the Nintendo 64 version, highlighting that several stages would be unique to this version of the game in both single-player and multiplayer mode. Of interesting note in this document is a brief exploration of the games that Sarge's Heroes 2 would need to compete against. This included Disney's Toy Story 2: Buzz Lightyear to the Rescue, a fantastic little 3D platformer which was released shortly after Sarge's Heroes on all the same platforms in November of 1999. The team at 3DO felt they could succeed against Toy Story by positioning their title as having a wider audience, with its cartoon violence appealing both to children and older players, whereas Toy Story seemed to focus much younger. Sarge's Heroes 2 shifts the tone to be even more light-hearted and goofy than the original. The core gameplay feels very comparable to the first game, after all, they only had a year, but that doesn't mean that nothing changed. The Bravo Company Commandos play a much more active role in the gameplay, more regularly taking part in combat and accompanying Sarge on missions. This was a major focus of the design document, and clearly something the developers felt had not been adequately realized in the first game. Vicky, Sarge's love interest, is now a playable character, and levels are now much shorter and more linearly structured. It is a shame to see the more open-ended level design missing from Sarge's Heroes 2, but shorter missions and thus more regular save points does alleviate some frustration from the first game. Sarge's Heroes 2 also just has much more varied level design, many with unique and interesting hooks. For example, one early level requires Sarge to reach the freezer of a refrigerator. To do this, he'll need to climb up through the shelves of the refrigerator itself, creating a highly vertical stage that feels entirely new to this entry. In general, despite its short development time, Sarge's Heroes 2 nicely refines a lot of the first game. Meanwhile, over on the PlayStation, valiant efforts were made to create a version of Sarge's Heroes 2 that was a bit more in line with the limitations of the hardware. Rather than using cut-down versions of the stages from the N64 version, as the first game had done, the stages in Sarge's Heroes 2 are more intentionally redesigned for PlayStation. For example, that fridge level I mentioned earlier takes place entirely in the freezer on the PlayStation and lacks the vertical platforming that the PlayStation version of their engine seemed to sort of struggle with. As a result, I'd say the PlayStation version is a significantly improved experience this time around compared to the first game. The only downside is that, as highlighted in that design document, the Nintendo 64 version has stages that are entirely absent from the PlayStation version. For example, on the Nintendo 64, after Sarge destroys a tan serum in the freezer, he radios Vicky, telling her to meet him back at the portal. You then play as Vicky as she navigates through the inside of a wall, platforming across cords and fighting off bugs. The two make it back to the portal, where they're told the serum is being created by Dr. Mad in his castle, and the two set off together to find it. Meanwhile, over on the PlayStation, after Sarge finds the serum, we just cut to castle. No intermediary stage, no cutscene explaining where we are, just a loading screen with a text dump and straight in. A PlayStation 2 port would also come along the following year that would combine the level design of the other two versions with the pre-rendered cutscenes of the PlayStation version to make a sort of ultimate version. It's honestly really good. The only problem is that because it relies on the PlayStation cutscenes rather than the N64 cutscenes, it's missing all the same levels. Now, despite overall being a more refined version of the original that improves on it in a variety of ways, by September of 2000, Army Men was already oversaturating the market. Reviews for Sarge's Heroes 2 were noticeably lower than the first game. Despite only being 2 years into the Army Men series, Sarge's Heroes 2 was already the 9th Army Men game. 9. In 2 years. What started as a success for 3DO was quickly becoming a joke, written off as low-budget shovelware. The series would of course continue beyond the Nintendo 64. Air Combat got a sequel on PlayStation, PlayStation 2, and GameCube that, as you'd expect, has 3 different titles depending on what region and platform you purchase the game for. Sarge's Heroes would become a trilogy, culminating in Sarge's War, a remarkably dark and introspective game being developed by what little remained of Mendheim's Army Men team as layoffs slowly whittled away at the company.
I love Sarge's Heroes. It's one of my favorite projects I've ever done. I love the characters. It's just what happened to Army Men was very upsetting to me. And at that time, I was trying to get a project out the door that I thought could actually be a very successful product for 3DO, which was a game called Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse. That's the product at that time, since every Army Men game we shipped just went straight from the 3DO studio to the bargain bin. And we wanted to do Four Horsemen, but they wanted a new Sarge's Heroes game. I wanted to do Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse. At that time, the company we were doing layoffs, and it was just awful. And it wasn't a product I wanted to do. I could have quit. Like a lot of people go, well, why don't you just quit? Well, I love 3DO, and I didn't want to quit. And I love the people, and I thought somehow, some way I'd be able to do Four Horsemen, but not the case. So while I was doing Sarge's Heroes, I just felt so bad how this brand that could have really had some longevity to it, how it was kind of died there because it was just too much of a good thing, too much greed at pumping these products out. So yeah, I wanted to make a little statement, and I killed all the characters. I knew the end was coming, and I just figured I loved all those characters and everything, and I knew it was like the end for me. It was the end for all these great people at 3DO, and I thought it was a fitting ending to 3DO's last game.
Sarge's War would ultimately be delivered complete and ready to go to Global Star, who had purchased the Army Men IP from the bankrupt 3DO. While Global Star did release a few other games under the Army Men branding, fans generally consider Sarge's War to be the last true game in the series. I've always felt it was a somewhat appropriate end. Given that Sarge gave an identity to the franchise, it was only fitting that he would send it off. That was a lot of history, but now let's get to today. What if you want to play the Nintendo 64 Army Men titles today? As of writing this, the only Army Men games currently available for purchase through modern storefronts are the 5 PC titles, which are available through GOG if you're interested. Technically, there's also a mobile game published by 2K that's not good. As for the N64, you're stuck with hunting down the original cartridges, which are luckily pretty common and inexpensive, or, of course, emulation. Now, obviously, there are a bunch of different versions of these games on various platforms, with some being ports and some being entirely different games, so let's real quick review all of them and sort them out. Army Men Sarge's Heroes on the Nintendo 64 is the original version of that game. I suppose you could say as the developers intended it. It was ported to Dreamcast, which runs better, has better graphics and full voice acting, but has some weird input loss that takes some getting used to. Still, I'd say it's a pretty good version of the game. It's actually the first version I played as a kid before getting the Nintendo 64 version. The PlayStation version is an entirely different game that uses simplified versions of the levels from the Nintendo 64 game. It isn't horrible, but it's just very different and obviously doesn't have the 4-player split screen. However, it does have some great pre-rendered cutscenes. The PC version, which to be honest I have never played, appears to be a straight port of the PlayStation version. Army Men Air Combat, or Air Attack, is great on both PlayStation and Nintendo 64. They each have their own visual advantages and disadvantages, but both play great. As far as single-player content, they are identical, outside of some voice acting and pre-rendered cutscenes in the PlayStation version that obviously don't make it to the Nintendo 64. Meanwhile, the Nintendo 64 version has more multiplayer modes, and once again goes up to 4 players instead of 2. This one also got a Game Boy Color version, which honestly does a pretty good job of maintaining a lot of the core gameplay and some of the general mission structure and objectives. It's not how I would recommend playing the game, but it's a decent port. Sarge's Heroes 2, I would once again argue is best on N64 due to the missing levels on both PlayStation and PlayStation 2. That being said, the PlayStation version is much better this time around compared to the first game. It just isn't really the full game when compared to the N64. The PlayStation 2 version plays very well and does a great job of mixing and matching the Nintendo 64 and PlayStation versions. It's just unfortunate that its reliance on the PlayStation cutscenes means it's missing all the same stages as the PlayStation version. That being said, kinda like the Dreamcast version of the first Sarge's Heroes, the PlayStation 2 version is a solid choice if you want something that feels slightly more modern. As for the Game Boy Color version, It's a vehicle-based game for some reason that has a completely different plot, and it isn't particularly good. But there you have it, the Army Men games for the Nintendo 64. Huge shout out to Frank Cifaldi and everybody at the Video Game History Foundation for their help with this episode, and to Michael Mendheim for providing some first-hand insight into these games. All three of them are a huge part of my childhood, and I'm so glad I was able to give them this extra special episode of Third Party 64. If you enjoyed this episode, consider checking out some of the others I've already done. Don't worry, they're not all this long, because they aren't all covering 3 games at once. And once again, check out my other video over on the Video Game History Foundation's YouTube channel for a deep dive into even more new things we learned about the production of Army Men Sarge's Heroes, and just a great behind-the-scenes look at that game. Finally, if you'd like to hear that entire interview with Michael Mendheim talking about his incredible career, you can find that in an upcoming episode of the Video Game History Hour podcast on your podcast provider of choice. If you don't already listen to that podcast, you should. It is a favorite among most of the staff of Nintendo World Report. You can learn so much about video game history from that podcast, either from experts or from the people who made the games. I was actually on it for an episode about Star Fox Command at one point, so you can start there and then branch out. It's a great show. You can, as always, find more at NintendoWorldReport.com. You can chat with us about this or anything else Nintendo related in our Discord using the link in the description, and you can stick around for more information on our Patreon. But that's all for me. Once again, my name's John Rairdin. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you next time. This video is made possible by our generous supporters on Patreon. Did you know that Nintendo World Report is funded directly by fans like you? When you support Nintendo World Report on Patreon, you get immediate access to multiple exclusive podcasts every month, exclusive Discord channels, an early look at select content, and more. All for as little as $1 a month. Check out patreon.com/NWR for all the details.